Hello and welcome to The Diverse Bookshelf with me, Samia Aziz. On this show, I interview incredible authors doing a deep dive into important themes and issues while talking all things books. I'm really excited to have Hafsa Lodi on the show today, as reading her book, Modesty, a Fashion Paradox, has made me think about an industry I know so little about, fashion. In her book, Hafsa uncovers the causes, controversies, and the players behind the global trend to conceal rather than reveal. She takes us through the growth and evolution of the modest fashion industry while also exploring the politics around modesty, hijab, and the clothing of people from different faiths. I found this book so insightful, and it made me reflect on the impact of the modest fashion industry on my life, both on a small, everyday level and also at a macro political level. Hafsa Lodi is an American journalist who has been covering fashion in the Middle East for the past decade. She was born in New York City and at the age of 14 relocated to the United Arab Emirates with her family, where she attended the Bay American Academy while interning after school with one of the region's leading publishing houses, ITP. After completing her graduate studies at the Ryerson School of Journalism in Toronto, Hafsa moved to London for a year, where she earned her master's degree in Islamic law at the School of Oriental and African Studies. While living in Dubai, Hafsa has written for the national newspaper, Luxury Magazine, Moje Magazine, Velvet Magazine, Savoir Flair and Vogue India, in addition to working as an online fashion editor for one of the Middle East's largest retailers, Boutique One. I'm so glad Hafsa's my guest today. Hello Hafsa, welcome to the show. How are you doing?
I'm great, thank you for having me.
I'm really excited to talk about your book, which is called Modesty, a Fashion Paradox. Now, just a disclaimer before we begin, I'm not very good with fashion. I tend to wear odd socks and clashing colours. But actually, I am very interested in the modest fashion industry in itself, just like the way that it's grown over the years, what it stands for, how it can empower people. And I'm really interested to see what happens with it as well. But when we talk about modest fashion and when you talk about modest fashion, what exactly are you referring to?
So I've come to describe modest fashion as clothing that covers the shoulders, often up to the wrists, covers the knees, often up to the ankles, may or may not include a head covering, high necklines, loose silhouettes, and non-see-through.
Do you think the parameters around that definition of modest fashion, do you think that that's changed over time, or do you think it's largely the same thing?
I think how one defines modesty is very much influenced by their religious or cultural group or affiliation that they have. I think overall, modest fashion was seen to be kind of this very religious or cult-like niche of clothing, maybe 10 or 20 years ago, at least in the West, where it was never deemed cool or trendy or fashionable. The words modest and fashion were never used together. It was kind of modesty was connoted with being frumpy and matronly when it came to clothing. But modest fashion has now become really stylish and fun and trendy. So I think definitely we're seeing a change in how modesty is perceived in mainstream fashion.
I mean, you don't go into this much in the book, but I mean, reading it and just also listening to you speak, when I think about watching, say, period dramas or The Crown or something, a lot of clothing that has been historically worn, especially by women, has followed this kind of parameter of modesty. It's very rare that we've seen pictures of kings and queens or higher members in class and society wearing things that are above the knee and having their shoulders bare. And I've always found that so fascinating, because it seemed like that kind of dressing has been perceived as being regal and very classy. But then when it comes to modest fashion in terms of a hijab or a jilbab or an abaya or anything that seems to have more a cultural connotation to it, I'd say, and possibly worn by a person of color as well, it's viewed so differently. And I just wondered what your thoughts on that were.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, historically, I mean, clothing was invented to cover our bodies as humans. So it was modest by that kind of definition. And even in Western history, yes, clothing was always covering women's bodies, even in swimwear, like you said, Victorian era and everything. And yeah, they tended to have sometimes have like those lower necklines, those heaving bosoms and whatever, but they still, skirts were floor length. They had layers under. Yeah, so it's interesting that you mentioned royalty. And like when I was researching for Modesty, for instance, I saw a lot of modest fashion headlines maybe around 2016, 2017. Even now, you'll see like Kate Middleton wears this
Mm.
modest gown, or at that time it was also Meghan Markle. There wasn't all this controversy around her as there is now, but oh, dress like the British royals, and get their look with these modest clothes from Reese or whatever the high street store is that they're wearing. And you didn't see that kind of attention with Muslim women. When Muslim women were wearing similar clothing that was modest, it wasn't kind of, oh, get this trendy look.
Mm.
So yeah, it's very different. There's this kind of white, as you mentioned, when hijabi women are wearing something, it isn't given that same kind of attention. And I think it's very much to do with white feminism. Western feminists see through this gaze where if it's a woman of color dressing modestly, and where it has this cultural aspect or connotation, such as the hijab or such as jilbab or an abaya or a burqa. Since the whole 9/11 invasion of Afghanistan and the whole need to liberate Muslim women from their burqas, this was all very like white feminist agenda. So Muslim clothing has typically remained in that sphere, not the trendy modest fashion. That's all changed now thanks to modest fashion bloggers and hijabi influencers on social media. But definitely 10 years ago, there was this kind of clear divide. There was modest fashion in terms of the Western celebrities who are covering their bodies, and they're doing so out of being empowered, and it's something respectable and admirable. And then when Muslim women are doing it, it's not so interesting.
Mm. Absolutely, absolutely. And I think, I think there's so much to say about the kind of the politics behind women's bodies, but especially women of color, Muslim women, Black women. Like, there's just so much to say around that. But I want to come back to this word modesty. So, I don't know about you, but I kind of have a little bit of almost like a love-hate relationship with the term like modest fashion, because I think on the one hand we have something looking modest, and maybe that's much how you described it in terms of it being like, floor length and whatnot, and like sleeves covered and those things. But then there's also the word modest, which holds a bit more of a, I mean, on the one hand, I guess like it has spiritual connotations, but the other side of it is that it's like a weighted kind of good versus bad, from like a judgment perspective. And so it makes it sometimes feel like modest fashion is superior in some ways to other fashion. And if something doesn't fit the definition of what you've said, does that mean that it can't be modest, or it can't be made modest, or it's worn by people that are then like corrupt socially or whatever it may be? And I just wondered what your take on that whole thing is, because I think there's just so much to think about.
Yeah, definitely. I feel as conflicted as you. A lot of the backlash when modest fashion first became this kind of trending buzzword in the industry, in 2017, 2018, a lot of the backlash, in the UK especially, was from women, non religious women, who said that, okay, if you're calling something modest fashion, what does that imply about us who don't ascribe to that sort of lifestyle and those sort of clothing choices? Are we immodest then? Are we immoral? Like, is that what you're saying about us? This is when Marks and Spencer started stocking like hijabs and I think bikinis, and there was all this kind of a call to boycott Marks and Spencer and all of this stuff. So yeah, I see. I also understand what you're saying about that judging element. Like, I tried to define modest fashion very loosely when we first started this discussion, but even then, modesty is so subjective, and it covers physical kind of elements of an outfit, but also there's an inner aspect, an inner element of modesty, as a virtue, modesty, being humble, and a lot of clothing that might be covering your body may not actually seem so modest, especially if it's kind of meant to show off your body, even while covering it. If it's showing it off, and if you're kind of showing it off on social media or on runways, it might be covering your skin, but are you displaying it in a way through behavior that's modest? So yeah, there's that tension. But then also by us questioning, is this modest or not? Like, it's just, you go down this rabbit hole, and I find myself doing that often whenever I think about modesty and talk about modesty, and I feel myself kind of spiraling into this. When I first set out to write this, it was very much, we need to stop judging women by what they're wearing, whether they're covering up or whether they're not covering up. But by discussing it so much and by analyzing it so much, I can't help but think that I'm part of the problem. By we just keep discussing women's bodies, and when it's Muslim women's bodies and what they're wearing, I find that really problematic, like on a personal level. So I feel like it's very tough to discuss this without judging. But I feel like throughout my journey with this modest fashion book and writing about it, I've kind of developed this critical lens. Like, I can catch myself when I'm judging somebody. Like, I would never now look at somebody and say, oh, that's not modest. When I was first kind of looking at, oh no, I need to interview women who dress modestly. No, that person doesn't make the cut because that's not modest. I would never do that now, because I understand there are so many different levels and such a spectrum of modesty. And like you said, the phrase might seem like problematic. I know some entrepreneurs and some designers have tried to use other words like conservative or covered up chic, or there's the IFDC, the Islamic Fashion and Design Council, that when they launched their kind of modest fashion program, it was called Pret a Cover. But even that, like, I think it's hard for us to ditch modest fashion as a phrase altogether, because it does describe this kind of niche of clothing well. And I kind of like to see it as, like athletic wear or maternity wear or petite size clothing. It's just a different category, and it shouldn't carry all this weight. It's us who put this weight onto the term.
That's really interesting, because before you said that, I was just about to ask you that if by labeling it, are we taking the idea of dressing modestly, are we making it something that is away from the norm? Because I remember, especially when I was a lot younger, and there was almost like a surgence of these Muslim fashion bloggers, especially on Instagram. And I felt that what they were doing was just trying to kind of like normalize, look, I wear high brand or high end labels too, and I look great, and I love, and even though I'm Muslim, I'm making it work. And so it kind of felt like it was not making it stand out as a separate thing, but just kind of like showing that, we also, whatever, however they were doing it, but it's kind of more in terms of like normalizing it. By labeling it something, by giving it a separate name, is it making it stand out, and is that a good or a bad thing?
I think it can be both. I think for women who are not so savvy with putting clothing together, with styling, or with picking out outfits, with shopping, if they feel overwhelmed, they don't know maybe how to layer something very well, I think it can help to have a kind of modest section for them, maybe. But not all women who are modesty conscious need that separation at all. For some of them, it sucks the fun out of it, actually, out of shopping. For some people, they prefer, even through researching, when I interviewed some women for this book, some said that, I would never shop in the modesty section of a store. If H&M did a modest collection, or, Primark, or all these brands that have done modest collections, ASOS, that's not where they look for their modest clothing. They look at the regular clothing, and they just pair it and layer it in a way that abides by their modesty parameters. So I think for some people it can help, but I think it's not needed. And also it brings up that question then, that if we're separating modest fashion from the rest of the mainstream clothing, are we further othering it? Are we, as a kind of counterproductive when we're trying to have modesty seamlessly integrated into the mainstream fashion industry. Does labeling it modest really help that case? No, probably not. So, and it also then kind of attracts, like, if you're just a regular woman, secular, non-religious, in the West, looking for a job or an outfit to wear for a job interview, say, or a lunch with your grandparents, and subconsciously you're thinking of something more modest. But if you see a section labeled modest fashion, that's not where you're going to go. You're going to go in the where you regularly shop. So I think labeling it as modest might attract only the faith-based consumers, whereas many regular women who are not kind of ascribe to this modest fashion lifestyle, but do require modest clothing for certain occasions in their life, they may not necessarily gravitate towards it if it's separated or sectioned off.
Yeah, it's just, it's so interesting because I guess there's like no definitive like answer. I guess it depends like who you are, where you're coming from, but also like where you're living and your own relationship to modest fashion and the word modesty, and whether you're a person of a particular faith or none. I think all of these things inform your relationship with fashion, full stop, regardless of how modest it is or isn't. And yes, that's why I felt like reading your book was that although it was written at a specific time and has interviewed certain people, there's something about it that feels quite kind of timeless, in that I don't think there's going to be an end in the way that modest fashion is evolving, and it feels like something that is massively growing. But I just want to talk a little bit about how you came to writing the book, what you sought to achieve through it, and yeah, like what your process was like.
Yeah, so I have been a fashion and lifestyle journalist in the Middle East for about 12 years now. And in around 2016, when Halima Aden, the hijabi model in America, walked a show for Kanye West's Yeezy fashion show, she became like the first hijabi model on a runway, and it kind of made headlines everywhere and started off this huge movement of hijabi models on runways, which was never really thought of as a possibility before. I had never imagined I would see a hijabi model on a runway at a mainstream New York Fashion Week show. And so I was working for a newspaper in Abu Dhabi at the time, and that story just kind of landed in my lap. I was the one Muslim staff writer on the lifestyle desk. And I was writing about fashion, so it just kind of was a natural fit. And I wrote this story called Modest Modeling, an Oxymoron, ? So that was the story, I think, something along those lines, about Halima Aden, about this whole modest fashion. It was just beginning this kind of movement. And from then on, all those kind of modest fashion stories just landed in my lap, whether it was an abaya designer in the Gulf making a new collection, or an American hijab label, or something like Dina Tokyo in the UK. All of these kind of modest fashion stories I was writing a lot about. And then I never thought I would write an entire book about it at all. I was quite comfortable in my journalist life. But then I was approached by Neem Press, a London-based indie publishing house. I don't know if it would be categorized as indie anymore. It's grown quite a bit since then. But Archana from Neem Press, she reached out to me and said, I have this project in mind, but I don't want to discuss it on email. Are you coming to London anytime soon? And I happened to be traveling to London that summer. So I went and we met up, and she told me, I really want to publish a book about this whole modest fashion movement. So much of it makes no sense to me. Like, how is modest fashion modest? There were all these questions she had. And there were questions I had too, and questions I never really felt I had the chance or opportunity to explore in depth in any of the newspaper or magazine articles I was writing. There was always that 1,000 or at most 1,200 word limit, and thinking of having the chance to just write kind of endlessly about modest fashion, hit all of these different discussion points, from the history of modest fashion, the cultural significance, the politics. The politics is such a huge angle that that we didn't want to shy away from. So yeah, of course I said yes. I think I did the first draft within 6 months. I was pregnant at the time, and I wanted to have it done before I had my baby. So then I had the baby, gave the first draft. I think maybe it took another 6 months or a year or so in getting that final draft out there. And yeah, so that's how the book opportunity came along, and I'm so grateful it did.
So 6 months feels like a really quick turnaround for a book.
Yes,
And
yeah,
it's
it's
written.
not normal.
Yeah.
Because I had written all of these stories about modest fashion already. I had maybe like 20, 30 interviews already I had done while working for, the newspaper and the various magazines I'd written for. So I kind of had these sources already, like in a little black book in my pocket, basically, that I could just then go to. Hey, thanks for speaking to me about this last year, but now I'm writing a book about it, and now I'd like to talk to you about this. So I had a lot of, I had you could say I had a good step up in when I started this project. And I think if I didn't have that, I wouldn't have been able to take on the project. But I was already so immersed in this modest fashion world that I was able to do it. Yeah.
I mean, a big part of the book, I think it kind of happens throughout the book, is you speak with a number of modest fashion bloggers and influencers and models. And it's really interesting to see the role that the internet plays in the development of this industry, but also I think in how comfortable Muslims feel, or people of faith feel, in expressing their identity. What were some of the sort of like takeaway points that you have from the people that you interviewed for the book?
Yeah. So it was, I knew I had to make this book a voice-driven book, and speak to these women who have helped shape the sector. And of course, without internet, without social media, we wouldn't have had this modest fashion revolution. It is largely due to Instagram and the role of the modest fashion blogger, hashtag modest fashion blogger, that we had this focus on modesty. Key takeaways. Okay, let's start with the haram police. So I had always heard about the haram police, basically these critics, for I guess that's the kindest word I can come up with, who sit and criticize Muslim women anonymously, or sometimes not anonymously, on social media, commenting things like, "You're showing your neck, sister," or "Oh no, I can see your ankles, you're going to hell," or "You're not a real Muslim," or like really vile, rude, disgusting comments. And it was interesting to speak to women firsthand about their experiences. There was one a hijabi fashion blogger who I really admire, who I loved her page. I found it was so wholesome and balanced. And she told me a story about a father messaging her on Instagram saying, "My daughter follows you, and I'm so disappointed that you wear your hijab in this turban style." I mean, it was something literally about this. He was just, degrading her choice of head covering. First of all, she covers her head. Imagine she didn't, like she covers her head. She's a Muslim. She Instagrams about praying, about going to mosques, about reading Quran, about cooking. She's like just about travel. She was living in Kuwait at the time, I believe. And so hearing stories like this, that like some father messaged her, like not just a random, one-liner from a random account, but an actual dad who was a father of a daughter, to speak so rudely to another Muslim woman, to your sister in the Ummah. I just found this horrible. And then it was interesting to see that even across other faith groups, there's an Orthodox Jewish fashion blogger I interviewed as well. She also said that she gets a lot of hate from her community. So I thought, going into this project, I was very optimistic and enthusiastic about it. And it's like, modest fashion is this uniting force amongst Muslim women across the globe, and it's this interfaith movement. And it was really disappointing and disheartening to learn about this element of it, about the haters, basically. So, and that hasn't changed at all over the years. I mean, it's been 3 years since the book came out. It's been 5 years since I started interviewing people. So nothing's really changed. In many cases, it's gotten worse. So I feel like it's a big problem. It's kind of like an ugly side of the modest fashion world that we don't often talk about, but it's yeah. Sorry if you wanted something more positive.
And actually, I wanted to touch on this as well, because it's really really awful and really disheartening as well. I think especially because so many Muslim fashion bloggers and influencers, a lot of them started off when they were really young, and it was a way for them to explore also like their faith and their Muslim identity growing up in the West. And it helped, I think, so many other people to feel confident in doing the same thing. So it's really sad to see, but also just kind of really difficult to accept that that kind of hate exists. How you can take someone who is doing their best, and like Islam may have certain, and I guess the same with Judaism, have certain rules and regulations and ideas about the way that people should live their lives, but it is also a faith of compassion and justice and kindness, and how you can completely disregard somebody who is doing no harm, like who is literally just trying to live their life. Yeah, it's really, really sad. And I think, and you do talk about this in the book as well, how the hate, I think, for modest fashion bloggers and models seems to come from all angles, because not only is there a resistance from inside the community, but then you've got the other side, which is the Islamophobic or the anti-Semite behavior. And I don't know how people can navigate that. What have you found out about that?
I found that especially for these influencers, like it can cause a lot of anxiety, and it's really sad because, as you said, a lot of times their intentions start out very humble and very modest in the inner sense of the word, and they're very young and they're exploring, and their modesty journeys are maybe just at their beginnings. For all women, but also Muslim women, modesty is like a very personal and ever evolving journey. You may one day think one thing is appropriate for your body, and a few years later change your opinion about what you feel comfortable in, or what you think is religiously mandated or not. So I think people who kind of portray this all on the internet as they're growing up, and they build all these followings, and the public basically witnesses their own personal modesty journeys and then believes that they have a say in these people's personal lives. Like, I think it's very tough. It's the most clear when we see these formerly hijabi models taking their hijabs off for whatever personal reasons, and then just getting showered with hate from their followers. And I think it's so unfortunate, and it's so sad, and it just causes more anxiety and mental health issues for these women who very courageously took on these public roles. Yes, they earn money and fame from it, but it's not easy to put your personal life out there and all these pictures on the internet that you can never take back. Really, they're just everywhere now. Maybe they got married or they became mothers, and their definitions of modesty changed, and they changed. I mean, we change as women, as motherhood and marriage, they change us, and you may not be comfortable with how you dressed 10 years ago. And I think it's just, sorry if I don't even remember your question. I'm just trying to, how do they deal with it? I think there's no answer. I think for some people, they just continue to showcase their lives on the internet, whatever that may be, whether it's modest fashion or whether it's just their lives as entrepreneurs or as mothers. Some have become mummy bloggers. It's interesting to see that kind of segue. And then for some of them, they just leave social media because either it doesn't serve any purpose anymore, or it became too much to handle mentally.
It's really sad, I think, to see anybody receive hate and criticism online, and I think because there's so much politics around women and Muslim women and the hijab, people get so riled up when really it's actually none of their business, or there's just no need for it. There's really no need for it. And I wanted to talk about the politics of hijab and modest fashion. It's obviously again, it kind of runs throughout the book, and there's no way you could write a book about modest fashion without talking about the politics. But what did you really want to explore when it comes to the politics of hijab and modest fashion? And what did your research bring to light?
I was very interested in the bans, hijab bans, niqab bans, because this isn't something I had written that in depth about living in the UAE. It doesn't really apply to us here, but France and later Switzerland and even Quebec in Canada, I found it crazy that a Muslim woman who chooses to cover her hair may not be allowed in a certain government building, may not be allowed in a public swimming pool in a burkini, which is made out of swimwear fabric. It's not just a cotton t-shirt and leggings that she's wearing. She's wearing a literal swimsuit that just has more fabric than a bikini. These things I still get so riled up about. I still cannot believe that it's 2023 and there are still these bans in place in France. France is the best example. Yeah, the book came out March 2020, and COVID had just was just happening in the UK and in the UAE, and then we had mask mandating, and I found that absolutely ludicrous. That in France you could wear not only France, Switzerland also, there are a few other European countries, but you could wear a medical face mask, but you could not wear a niqab. If you wore a niqab, you would still get fined. I found that absolutely absurd and just completely ridiculous. I wrote maybe 5-6 different stories for different publications around this because I was just obsessed with it. I could not get over this topic. That Kanye West went to Paris Fashion Week wearing a balaclava, which covered his entire face except his eyes, in a country that has a niqab ban. And he was allowed to wear this ski mask, which made him look like a burglar. It was just, it's still unfathomable to me, and I cannot believe that we still have these rules. So I think that was one of the things I really wanted to highlight. Had this book come out a few months later, I could have included all of the COVID hypocrisy in the politics section. And it's interesting because when I had my first draft for the book had the politics section much later on. It started off with a history of modest fashion and why women cover up. But my publisher, Archana, said, no, it has to open with the politics. We have to put the politics up at front and say, why is this happening now? Why is this interesting? Why is this such a divisive topic now? So yeah, we decided to open with the politics.
Yeah.
Besides the the hijab bans, even then India started having these hijab bans after the book was published. That is absolutely mental. I mean, after the book was published, so much has happened, which just shows how this is so timeless. I mean, Afghanistan took back power, the Taliban took back power in Afghanistan, reinforced burqas on a country that hasn't had that mandate in so many years. Iran's hijab police kind of made headlines everywhere after the death of Mahsa Amini. I mean, this isn't going away. There's these very rigid rulings both in Eastern countries that are ruled by oppressive Islamist regimes, and in the West where Islamophobic governments are implementing these rulings. So I think I'm still really fascinated and interested by these polar opposites, but Muslim women are the ones who are affected by these limitations on how we can dress.
I also was really interested with the face mask compulsion during COVID because what struck me is that still the image of a woman in a burqa is considered alien, it's considered threatening, and it is used in the Daily Mail and tabloid newspapers alongside derogatory headlines or racist headlines or even classist headlines, and yet there's no kind of nuanced understanding that it's just a face covering and it's a choice that someone is making, and how the COVID face mask is you're protecting yourself against disease and illness and you're protecting other people, and at the same time we have these horrible kind of headlines that are simultaneously showed alongside women in burqa and jilbab. And we had that throughout COVID as well, especially when there were some headlines that were relating to the fact that certain communities are more vulnerable and certain communities were finding it more difficult to adjust to the rules because of family structure and community makeup and those kind of things. But the images were used very purposefully to be divisive.
It's crazy, but also it's very eye-opening, and it makes you understand the biases very clearly. It makes those biases very clear, which in a way is good. You come out of it a bit more aware of the world we live in and how those in power really pull the strings. And yeah, I get how Muslim women, how divisive the symbol of the hijab is, the veil, this, like you said, othered and alienating. These are the kind of symbols it represents when the mainstream Western media uses it. And it makes it so clear that it's not about the amount of skin that's covered, because if so, then there would have been similar conversations about face masks. But it's about the woman, the culture, the ethnicity, the religion that she belongs to.
Exactly. And then the stereotypes and the prejudice that comes with that, pertaining to how free she is, how educated she is, how empowered she is. One of the things I quite like about the internet generally is that how accessible things are to us and how accessible knowledge and information is to us now that 15-20 years ago we wouldn't have dreamed about having access to this. And I think that a lot about people as well, that social media has given us access in many ways to authors, to celebrities, to chefs. People can pose their questions directly, and obviously like people are very busy and they don't always get back to you, but just having that kind of close interaction and connection, I think, has really changed things. And I think that social media has also opened up fashion, because when I was a lot younger, I always felt like fashion was confined to the runways in Paris, right? Like London and London Fashion Week, Paris Fashion Week, New York Fashion Week. For me, it was all about these high-end designers, Gucci, Prada, what have you, right? All over the world. But it wasn't something that felt relevant to me. It wasn't something accessible to me, but it's completely changed. And I just wondered what your thoughts were, because obviously you've done a lot of writing about fashion, on the accessibility of fashion and how that has probably just changed things more generally.
Yeah, completely. It changed how I shop. And I mean, I'm by career a fashion writer and stylist, but I get so much inspiration from the modest fashion bloggers I follow on Instagram, and maybe not even the modest fashion bloggers, the other random fashion bloggers or fashion editors who might wear something that I think, oh my God, that's so my style. Where did they get it? And quickly I search it, and quickly I find that they've linked the ballerina flats from Zara. I click on it, I buy it, I receive it in 2 days later. It's crazy. That happened actually. And when I got them, they weren't very comfortable, so I had to return them. But this happens often with me, and it's positive and negative. I mean, the negative side is it promotes this like endless consumerism. It makes you want to keep shopping. It makes you want to keep having new things. But if you have self-control, unlike me, it can really provide inspiration on how to style your the clothing you already own, and how, especially with modest fashion bloggers. I mean, dressing modestly was very difficult back in the day. I mean, you had to really think about what will not look frumpy, what will not look matronly, what will still look kind of stylish but still cover my skin. 10-12 years ago, if you wore a turtleneck under a dress, a sleeveless dress, that wouldn't have been deemed stylish. That would have been deemed really like geeky or nerdy or odd. But now that's trendy because fashion bloggers have done it. Gucci's done it now. I mean, and also it's no longer, I feel like the fashion industry is no longer about 3-4 trends that are dominating the trend cycle of the season, and those are the trends you have to wear in order to be stylish. No, I think we're seeing all these kind of these boundaries really open, and you can kind of flaunt any aesthetic. I mean, right now it's Barbie core because of the Barbie movie coming out. Everyone's wearing pink, and I was wearing pink before it was cool, okay? But you can really, people who may have never worn pink can wear pink because it's kind of the fad of the day. You can just experiment with all these things that you may have never tried experimenting with, and it's really fun. I love it. If not for social media, I mean, social media has really injected fun back into fashion for me. So yeah, I think the internet is great. And I don't think modest fashion would have had
Absolutely.
this
And I think
revolution, this moment in the limelight.
I mean, the negative side in terms of the consumerism, oh my gosh, yes, I fully agree with that, because I guess like fashion is just endless. You can just continually be chasing the next good look that suits you. But what I have liked seeing emerge online, especially in the last few years, is the kind of sustainable living, thrifting, recycling, reusing. There are a lot of bloggers now that encourage taking your old things and like giving it a new life. I'm sure there's a proper word for it, I don't know what it is, and like those kind of things, which I think is really, really good. That kind of like ethical side that shows you that even if you don't have much money or you're being more conscious with regards to the planet or whatever it may be, there's still ways that you can up your game, I guess, when it comes to fashion, which has been really nice to see. But obviously the fashion industry is an industry, right? So all businesses have a business interest. A lot of the fashion bloggers are now earning money. Some of them are doing it full time. So it is their source of income. And I guess when that happens, you've got a capitalist agenda. And so that's why we've seen a lot of big brands that have kind of jumped on the modest fashion bandwagon. And you detail it a lot in the book as well. And you talk about, you give examples where it's been done specifically around Ramadan. They have like a Ramadan collection. But there's also small brands that are very intentional in their modest fashion because they want to serve a faith-based community. They understand the needs of the community and it feels a little bit more intentional. What are your views on the role that big brands play in the industry and what the potential implications are then on small businesses and brands and what we can do about that?
I think there's been positives and negatives of big brands dabbling in the modest space. So in a way, it's really helped portray modest fashion in a positive light, in a fashionable light. Having brands like H&M and COS and even Primark. I mean, there's so many. Then there's so many high-end labels and Uniqlo. All of these brands, having them kind of put their stamp of approval on modest fashion and hire or recruit these hijabi models to front their campaigns. It really helps it helps us. It helps our demographic. It helps our agenda in making modest fashion more acceptable and stylish and digestible in the West, which is, yes, sad that we have to feel like we have to do that, but there's a positive aspect to it. A trickle down of that positive aspect may be that then these smaller faith-based labels who create modest fashion might start gaining new clients who may not be from their particular communities, but are suddenly interested in modest fashion thanks to the mainstream kind of appeal of it and are now seeking out modest fashion from smaller labels too. But the negative side is that this mass commercialization of modest fashion and the fact that all these big retailers are now producing it, that they might eat up all of these smaller labels who maybe their clothing is slow fashion, it's ethically produced, it's maybe more costly, they might lose some of their customers. We see this especially, I think, with like modest activewear. Modest activewear was a very specific niche of modest fashion that wasn't available in big Western retailers, sports hijabs, and modest swimwear. So I see in hijab, activewear, and swimwear, these things were very, very niche, and there were certain faith-based entrepreneurs who really saw this gap in the market and began producing clothing, designing and producing clothing to cater to fill this gap. But then we had Nike and Under Armour and Adidas, and now every mainstream sports retailer now has modest athletic wear. They have sports hijabs, they have burkinis. So some of these smaller labels have disappeared because there simply isn't the demand that there was for it. They can now, fill that. They can now buy that clothing from a mainstream retailer. They don't need to seek out these smaller brands. Which is sad, yes. I mean, even Nike, like when they made their first sports hijab, it was kind of marketed as the world's first sports hijab. When, in Egypt and Pakistan,
Yeah.
and anyway, we've seen these sports hijabs like in the souks before. We've seen sports hijabs, we've seen burkinis. So yeah, it's a negative for sure. I personally believe that the positives outweigh the negatives when it comes to these big brands designing Modesty. It's just more accessible. It's just more. I mean, I would hate to see a Muslim-owned brand go under because of this. My hope would be that these big brands hire and work with Muslim designers to produce this kind of clothing, not only to produce it but to market it and to promote it. I think Muslims or modest dressers, modest consumers need to be involved in this process when the big brands are getting involved, because otherwise it's not done very authentically or very genuinely. I think you really need to have that like insider touch to get it right.
Yeah, I mean, you've probably experienced this as well, but many a time I have picked out a dress from a main brand, Zara, Primark, I don't know, and I've been like, oh wow, this looks great. Like there's like long sleeves and like it looks long. I bring it home and it's got like a massive slit right up to my waist, and the neckline is like really plunging, and I'm just like, no, this is not. This isn't part way there. Part way there. You have to fix it. So I think that obviously the modest fashion industry is growing and it's changing and it's sort of developing. It's not. I don't think it's like ready, because I do think that it has emerged from greater like demand and interest as well. And I mean, I'm excited to see what happens because I like the idea of like. I mean, when I think about myself, but I also think about like my nieces growing up. I like the idea of them having more options, being able to find more longer tops, for example, that just make them feel a bit more comfortable and a bit more at ease. Some of the options that I didn't have when I was younger, so I would have to put like a big heavy cardigan over everything, covers up the design on your t-shirt because you can't see it. So yeah, I really love that for people more generally. But when it comes to your book, because obviously your book was written at a specific time, and you have mentioned that so many interesting things in terms of like hijab and modesty and modest fashion have happened since then. But I wonder, is there anything that if you were redoing the book, or if you could go back to yourself in 2020, is there anything else that you would like to include?
So the original, my first draft was 10,000 words more than what was actually published. So a lot was cut out, and I would like to put a lot of that back in. There was a lot of historical context from other countries and regions that was cut out. In the end, we decided we had to like stick to like 5 countries as examples. I think it was Saudi, Iran, Indonesia, Turkey, Egypt, maybe, out of the Muslim countries that we focus on. But South Asia was completely left out of the book. India, Pakistan. I mean, and they may not contribute much to the global modest fashion scene, but I think it's still a very important. If they don't contribute to it in terms of designers, they do in terms of the labor. I mean, it's all being outsourced from there. So I think there's a lot more in terms of the historical, cultural context. The sustainability factor, I'd love to dive into that a lot deeper. It was very surfacely touched on in the book. But also, I mean, the whole Black Lives Matter movement started happening after the book was published, or maybe while it was being edited. And there's a lot of Black Muslim women have contributed to this modest fashion movement, but haven't really been credited for doing so. And I'd love to explore that further. There's so many. I mean, from American African American designers to models. I mean, then even the plus size modest fashion industry is its own kind of niche, which is not described in the book, but which I wrote about later. There's a blogger, her name's Leah Vernon, who just talks about this a lot. So I had interviewed her for a story, but it was after the book was published. So I've actually spoken to a lot of modest fashion personalities after the book was published who I would love to then, if we were ever doing a second edition, talk to in depth again more and kind of put their experiences in the book. Of course, COVID, the political element, we could triple the length of that chapter because of COVID.
Absolutely. Yeah. The biggest question the book poses is modest fashion a paradox? And obviously you can't sit here and regurgitate the whole book, but what are kind of some of your key points around that question and the answer? But I mean, my feel is that there's not one answer, but yeah, what are some of the key points that you hold with regards to that question?
I think if you are practicing modesty from a place of faith, it comes down to intention. Is your intent to attract attention? Is that modest? I think that's something I've started thinking about when I get ready in the morning every day, dressing and putting makeup on and whatever I'm wearing. Is your intent to dress for your creator? Is your intent to attract the attention of the opposite sex? Who are you dressing for? I think these are questions that it's very simple when it comes down to it. I mean, this is just from a faith-based perspective. From a non-faith-based perspective, it's a lot easier because you don't have these things to think about. But I think another takeaway would just be like, who are we judging? Like, why are we judging? Who are we judging? And who does that judgment serve? And is it to make us feel better about ourselves? Are we trying to help someone? I think there's a lot of judgment when it comes to discussions about modest fashion. And I definitely was kind of encumbered with a lot of these judgments before writing the book and during the research phase. And I've now only kind of let go of those judgments. I think maybe writing about this and thinking about it so much has liberated me of the judgy aspect, which I'm very grateful for. And I think, it just comes down to modesty is very personal and it looks different for everybody.
Yeah, I mean, I guess your first part of your answer, which was about if you're a person of faith, I guess the question is also slightly different. It's not just about modest fashion as an idea. It's about fashion in general. It's about the time that you spend in choosing what to wear. It's about
the money you spend,
the intention, exactly, the money that you spend, but also like how much of a priority in your life does it take, and then what do you do with it? Like, do you just get on with your life, or do you
get obsessed,
put yourself in situations?
Yeah.
Do you put yourself in situations where people can then see you and find you? Do you purposefully attract that attention? And I feel like it's a very big question, a very big topic, which is obviously why you've written a whole book about it. There was also 10,000 words initially longer, and you probably filtered yourself in that sense anyway in terms of shortening it. You could have probably written another 50,000 words. And I don't think there is an overarching answer. I think it depends on everybody's individual circumstances and their relationship to their faith, but also to fashion. Like, some people are just not interested in fashion trends, and they just, like me, I seek comfort, but I like bright colors and patterns, even if they don't match, and even if I look a bit strange, but I like it, right? Like, that's just, I feel like it's part of my personality. So I guess for me, like, that's what fashion is a way for me to express myself. For other people, it's about how they can fit in or how they can look a certain way or whatever it may be.
Yeah.
Exactly. And it's very different. Yeah, but it's a very loaded question, I guess, because of this element of morality and judgment. And I think we can be talking about it for hours and hours on end, and people can be reading and whatever they want for years until they come up with what they feel comfortable with. But I guess what it comes down to is the fact that the modest fashion industry and like these modest fashion bloggers are giving us something to celebrate in terms of our identity and being able to express ourselves and to escape some of the prejudices and stereotypes that come with people's views of Muslim women. And I think your book has gone, will go a long way in helping people navigate that if that's what they're interested in, or just in learning something new, because I am not, as I have said several times, I'm not like a very big on fashion at all, and I only knew a couple of the fashion bloggers that you mentioned, so I was like, oh wow, this is so interesting, there are so many people, and obviously there were loads of people that you also did an interview.
Yeah, there's so many more now than I mean, just kind of to build on that from like a mental health perspective, I had to really when I was writing the book and researching, I just followed every modest fashion blogger on Instagram that I came across. And a few months ago I had to do like a decluttering of who I follow, because it was almost becoming too much. Like, these weren't real women anymore that I was seeing. These pictures were not real. They were very filtered, very airbrush, very face tuned, very made up, very caked, very fake. A lot of them, I'm speaking generally, and it just wasn't that kind of wholesome, modest fashion vibe that the movement had kind of started out with. It was just very like, see, now I'm sounding judgy again. I'm catching myself, but it wasn't real. Like, I guess that's the only way to say it. It wasn't that real, unfiltered, raw, candid, bubbly, enthusiastic YouTube blogger who began with the modest fashion revolution 8-9 years ago. It's just this kind of conforming to Western beauty ideals and like plumped up, filled lips, and like just extensions on extensions of eyelashes. And I'm not judging. I wear eyelash extensions too. I think they're amazing. But I just felt like, how can I, if I'm drawing my influence from this kind of content, I'm going to be in a mess. So I just had to kind of unfollow a bunch of these modest fashion platforms, because they weren't serving my path or approach to modesty anymore. So I think, there's so much inspiration, and there's so many people in this space now, and it's so positive and it's so inspiring. But at the same time, you really have to choose who you draw your inspiration from.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, because I mean, fundamentally, if you're somebody that is on social media, if you're a fashion blogger on social media, or you're a model, there are going to be certain pressures that fall upon you in terms of like the way that you look. I know that kind of like Botox and surgery is becoming increasingly common amongst still very young women as well, which to me is one of the reasons why I don't follow many or any fashion bloggers, because it really it scares me, the idea that when I'm in my 50s, for example, or my 60s, I'm perceived that I have to look a certain way when I just kind of want to naturally age the way that God intended. Like, I just kind of, and we are losing that a little bit. And I'm really glad that you brought that up, actually, because there are many benefits, as we've discussed in this whole episode, about the modest fashion industry, but I think, and social media, but social media is also very harmful, and it has really negative impacts on people. So you were talking about yourself as a consumer, but also if you are an influencer, I can't imagine some of the mental health issues that people are facing just because of the pressures on them when they're in the limelight so much. Thank you for that. You know what, Hafsa, this has been really enlightening, really interesting. I have loved speaking to you. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you so much. I loved getting into these topics with you.
Thank you so much to Hafsa for such an insightful and interesting conversation. Although I'm not big on fashion, I really enjoyed everything that we talked about, and I hope that you benefited from this conversation too. If you enjoy the podcast, please follow The Diverse Bookshelf on your podcast platform of choice and connect with me on social media. I would really appreciate it if you could rate and leave a review, as it helps more people find the show.